What happens when respect is stripped away in full view of the world's most powerful people? What happens when success, achievement, and dignity mean nothing in the face of deep-rooted prejudice? And what happens when a man who built an empire from nothing is forced to choose between a $900 million deal and his self-worth? This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a brilliant black entrepreneur who climbed from the depths of poverty to the heights of corporate America, only to face the ugliest form of racism in the most prestigious setting imaginable. On a crisp October evening in 2023, at an exclusive charity gala in Manhattan's Upper East Side, Marcus stood before 500 of America's wealthiest and most influential people as the Whitmore family, worth $12 billion, humiliated him in ways that would have been unthinkable in polite society if he had been wiped out by the next morning. The partnership deal that would have transformed his renewable energy company into a global powerhouse was dead. Not because of market conditions, not because of financial concerns, but because Marcus chose dignity over dollars, principle over profit, and respect over riches. This isn't just another story about individual prejudice. This is a story about institutional power, about how racism operates in the highest echelons of society, and about the extraordinary courage it takes to walk away from generational wealth, when that wealth comes at the cost of your humanity. As we've seen in documented cases like the systematic discrimination faced by black executives at McDonald's, where the number of African Americans in top leadership positions dropped from 42 to just 7 under former CEO Steve Easterbrook. Racism in corporate America is not just individual acts of prejudice, it's a systemic assault on black excellence. Marcus Thompson's story teaches us that sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say, it's what you're willing to walk away from. This is his story, and it's a story that exposes the hidden cost of success while black in America. Marcus Thompson was born in 1985 in East Cleveland, Ohio, in a neighborhood where dreams went to die and hope was rationed like food stamps. His father, James Thompson, worked double shifts at a steel mill, while his mother, Dorothy, cleaned office buildings at night to make ends meet. The Thompson family lived in a 2-bedroom apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear their neighbors' arguments and thick enough to muffle their own dreams. The racial climate of 1990s Cleveland was a complicated tapestry of progress and prejudice. While the city had elected its first black mayor decades earlier, the economic devastation that followed the decline of manufacturing hit black communities hardest. Marcus grew up watching his father come home exhausted from a job that barely paid a living wage, his hands stained with industrial grease, and his spirits slowly worn down by supervisors who never saw him as anything more than another pair of hands. "Son," James would tell Marcus during their weekend walks through their neighborhood, "they don't expect nothing from us but failure. Every time a black man succeeds, he's not just winning for himself, he's proving them all wrong." Those words would echo in Marcus's mind for decades, through every achievement and every obstacle he would face. Education was the Thompson family's religion, and Dorothy was its most devoted practitioner. Despite working nights, she made sure Marcus had a quiet space to study, helped him with homework she didn't always understand, and saved every penny to buy him books that other kids took for granted. When Marcus showed exceptional aptitude in mathematics and science, Dorothy sacrificed her lunch money to pay for his participation in academic competitions. The inequality was stark and visible. Marcus's predominantly black elementary school had outdated textbooks, leaky roofs, and computers that barely worked, while the schools in the white suburbs had new facilities and resources that seemed limitless. But Marcus learned early that excellence was his only weapon against a system designed to diminish him. He studied while other kids played, read while others watched television, and dreamed while others accepted limitations. High school brought both opportunity and humiliation. Marcus earned a scholarship to St. Ignatius, an elite private school where he was one of only 12 black students among 1,200. The academic excellence he had cultivated served him well. But the social dynamics were brutal. He was frequently the only black student in advanced classes, often questioned about affirmative action by classmates who couldn't believe he belonged there on merit, and regularly excluded from social activities by families who saw him as an interesting charity case rather than an equal. The microaggressions were constant and corrosive. Teachers who seemed surprised by his intelligence, classmates who asked to touch his hair, guidance counselors who steered him toward practical career paths despite his exceptional grades. When Marcus expressed interest in studying engineering and business, his guidance counselor suggested he consider more realistic options like community college or trade school. The subtext was always the same: know your place. But Marcus's parents had taught him something more powerful than the capacity to endure insults. They had taught him to transform pain into purpose. Every slight became fuel for his ambition. Every barrier became motivation to build something better. By senior year, he had achieved perfect grades, scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests, and earned admission to MIT with a full scholarship. College was both liberation and education in the subtle arts of institutional racism. At MIT, Marcus excelled academically, graduating summa cum laude with degrees in electrical engineering and business administration. But he also learned how racism operated in elite institutions, not through overt hostility, but through assumptions, exclusions, and the constant burden of being the representative of his entire race. Study groups that somehow forgot to invite him. Professors who gave his ideas less consideration until white students repeated them. Job recruiters who seemed surprised by his credentials and asked probing questions about his background that they never asked white candidates. Networking events where he was often mistaken for catering staff or asked if he was there through a diversity program. After graduation, Marcus joined Goldman Sachs as an investment banker, where he quickly earned a reputation for brilliant analysis and innovative thinking. But advancement came slowly, despite his exceptional performance. He watched less qualified white colleagues receive promotions, while he was told he needed more seasoning and leadership presence. Code words he had learned to recognize as racial barriers disguised as professional development. The breaking point came during a client meeting where a senior partner introduced him as our diversity hire, rather than by his actual credentials and achievements. Marcus had spent 2 years building the client relationship and designing the financial structure for their deal, but his expertise was diminished to a checkbox in the firm's diversity initiatives. In 2015, at age 30, Marcus made the decision that would define his life. He left Goldman Sachs to start his own company, Thomson Renewable Solutions, focused on developing clean energy technology for underserved communities. Working from a shared office space in Brooklyn, living on savings and determination, Marcus built his first prototype revolutionary solar panel system that could be manufactured at a fraction of traditional costs. The company grew systematically and strategically. Marcus understood that as a black entrepreneur, he would face skepticism and barriers that white founders never encountered. Every pitch had to be perfect, every financial projection had to be conservative, and every team member had to be exceptional. He couldn't afford the luxury of failing fast and pivoting like his white counterparts. He had to succeed slowly and deliberately. By 2020, Thomson Renewable Solutions had secured major contracts with cities across the Northeast, developed partnerships with environmental nonprofits, and attracted investment from progressive venture capital firms focused on environmental and social impact. The company was valued at $200 million and employed 150 people, making Marcus one of the youngest black CEOs in the renewable energy sector. By 2023, Thomson Renewable Solutions had reached $1.5 billion in valuation and was poised for international expansion. Marcus had built the company of his dreams, created jobs in communities that looked like his childhood neighborhood, and proving that Black excellence could thrive in any environment. He had achieved everything his parents had dreamed of and more. But he was about to learn that in America, no amount of success could completely insulate a Black man from the humiliation of racism, especially when that racism came from those who considered themselves untouchable. The Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dender had been transformed into a glittering wonderland for the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, one of New York's most exclusive charity events. Crystal chandeliers cast ethereal light over the ancient Egyptian temple, while 500 of America's most powerful individuals mingled beneath the soaring glass ceiling. The guest list read like a who's who of billionaires, celebrities, and political leaders, each paying $50,000 per table to support environmental causes while networking among their own elite circle. Marcus Thompson adjusted his custom-tailored tuxedo as he surveyed the scene from the cocktail reception. After 8 years of building Thomson Renewable Solutions into one of the fastest-growing clean energy companies in America, he belonged in this room not as someone's guest or token diversity representative, but as an equal among peers. His company's valuation had just crossed $1.5 billion, and tonight was supposed to be the celebration that preceded the announcement of the largest deal in his company's history. The Whitmore family, Harold, his wife Patricia, and their adult children. Harrison and Victoria controlled a $12 billion industrial empire built over 4 generations. Their foundation was one of the largest environmental funders in the world, and their business portfolio included manufacturing, logistics, and increasingly renewable energy investments. For 6 months, Marcus had been negotiating a $900 million partnership that would integrate Thomson Renewable Solutions, revolutionary solar technology, into Whitmore Industries' global supply chain. Marcus. Harold Whitmore's voice boomed across the reception area as he approached with his signature politician's smile. At 68, Harold had the bearing of a man who had never been told no, his silver hair perfectly styled and his handshake calculated to convey dominance. "So good of you to join us tonight. Patricia was just saying how interesting it is to have you here." The pause before interesting was slight but unmistakable. Marcus had learned to recognize these verbal tics, the subtle ways that white elites signaled their discomfort while maintaining plausible deniability. He smiled and extended his hand, noting how Harold's grip lingered just long enough to establish power dynamics. "Thank you for the invitation, Harold. I'm looking forward to celebrating our partnership announcement tomorrow." Marcus's voice carried the confidence of someone who had earned his place in this room, despite the subtle resistance he could already sense. Patricia Whitmore glided over, her $50,000 Hermes dress and family diamonds reflecting the museum's lighting. She had the brittle beauty of someone who had spent decades in high society, her smile practiced and her assessment immediate. "Marcus, darling, you look so put together tonight. Who dressed you?" The question hung in the air like a slap disguised as conversation. Marcus had been asked about his clothing, his hair, his background, and his credentials more times than he could count questions that successful white executives never faced. The implication was always the same. "You don't belong here naturally." "I dressed myself, Patricia," Marcus replied evenly. "Same way I built my company." The conversation continued with surface-level pleasantries, but Marcus could feel the family's discomfort. Harrison Whitmore, 35 and heir apparent to the family business, joined the group with his wife Chloe, both regarding Marcus with the kind of anthropological interest usually reserved for museum exhibits. "So Marcus," Harrison began, swirling his scotch, "I've been reading about your company. Impressive what you've built." "Considering." The word considering dangled with unspoken implications about Marcus's background, his race, and his supposed disadvantages. Considering what, exactly? Marcus asked, his tone remaining professional despite the provocation. Oh, Harrison continued with practiced casualness, the challenges in your community. The education gaps, the family structure issues. It's remarkable that you overcame all that to build something legitimate. The conversation around them gradually quieted as other guests began to listen. Marcus recognized the moment for what it was, a public test of his composure, designed to establish hierarchy in front of an audience that would remember how he responded. He thought of his father's words about proving them wrong, about his mother's sacrifices, about every black entrepreneur who had faced similar moments. My community produced me, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the expanding circle of listeners. The same work ethic, values, and determination that built Thompson Renewable Solutions exists in every black community in America. The difference isn't what's in our communities, it's what's been kept out of them. Harrison's smile faltered slightly, but Victoria Whitmore chose that moment to escalate the confrontation. At 32, she had inherited her mother's sharp tongue and her father's sense of entitlement, along with an MBA from Wharton that she wielded like a weapon in social combat. That's a lovely sentiment, Marcus, Victoria said, her voice dripping with condescension. But let's be realistic about how you got here. Affirmative action, minority business set-asides, diversity quotas. There are so many programs to help people like you succeed. It's not really the same as building something from nothing like our family did. The circle of listeners had expanded to include several dozen guests, and Marcus could feel the weight of their attention. This was the moment he had been prepared for his entire life, when success, achievement, and merit would be dismissed as products of racial preferences rather than excellence. But he had never faced it so publicly, so deliberately, and from people who held his company's future in their hands. People like me? Marcus repeated, his voice steady but his eyes hardening. You mean Americans who built businesses that employ thousands of people and generate billions in economic activity? Or do you mean something else? The question forced the Whitmores to either clarify their racist implications or retreat from them. They chose a third option: escalation. Don't get defensive, Marcus, Harold Whitmore interjected, his tone patronizing. Victoria is simply acknowledging reality. Your success is admirable, but it's important to recognize the advantages you've had. Minority business certification, diversity investments, set-aside contracts. These are valuable resources that our family never had access to. The irony was staggering. Marcus was being lectured about unearned advantages by a man who had inherited a billion-dollar company built on generational wealth, government contracts, and exclusive networks that had excluded people like Marcus for centuries. But the audience seemed to accept Harold's framing, nodding along as if Marcus's achievements were indeed the product of racial preferences rather than exceptional capability. Let me understand this correctly, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. You're suggesting that my MIT degrees, my Goldman Sachs experience, my patents, my company's billion-dollar valuation, and our revolutionary technology are all products of affirmative action? Not all of it, Patricia Whitmore said with false generosity. But you have to admit, the playing field isn't level. There are so many programs to help minorities now. It's almost unfair to white entrepreneurs who have to compete without those advantages. The statement revealed the core of their worldview, that equality felt like oppression to those accustomed to privilege, that diversity programs were unfair advantages rather than corrections to historical exclusion, and that Marcus's presence in their elite circle was an aberration to be explained rather than an achievement to be celebrated. What happened next would be replayed on social media, analyzed in business schools, and remembered as a defining moment in corporate America's reckoning with racism. Marcus looked around the circle of faces, some uncomfortable, some smug, some simply curious about how this confrontation would resolve, and made a decision that would cost him $900 million. You want to talk about advantages? Marcus said, his voice carrying to every corner of the reception area. Let me tell you about advantages. Harold, you inherited your first company from your father, who inherited his wealth from his father, who built his fortune on government contracts and immigrant labor paid slave wages. You attended prep schools that cost more per year than most American families earn, went to Ivy League universities where your family's donations guaranteed admission, and entered a business world where every door was opened by nepotism and old boy networks. The room had fallen completely silent. 500 of America's most powerful people watching a black man publicly challenge the mythology of white self-made success. Patricia, you've never worked a day in your life outside of charity boards and social functions, yet you have the audacity to question my work ethic. Victoria, your MBA was purchased with family money. Your first job was handed to you by family connections, and your current position exists because of your last name, not your capabilities. Harrison, you failed at every independent venture. You've attempted, surviving only on family bailouts and trust fund income. Marcus paused, looking directly at each family member. You want to lecture me about unearned advantages while standing on foundations built by 4 generations of systematic exclusion of people who look like me. The only reason we're having this conversation is that your ancestors made sure my ancestors couldn't be in this room. The humiliation was complete and public. In front of their peers, their social circle, and their business associates, the Whitmore family had been exposed as the beneficiaries of the very advantages they claimed Marcus possessed. But rather than retreat or apologize, they chose to escalate. In the most vicious way possible, Harold Whitmore's face had turned red with rage and embarrassment. How dare you speak to my family that way? He hissed, his voice low but carrying across the silent room. You forget yourself, boy. The word boy hit like a physical blow, its historical weight and racial violence unmistakable to everyone present. It was the linguistic equivalent of a lynching rope, designed to strip Marcus of his dignity, his achievements, and his humanity in front of the most powerful people in America. The room gasped collectively. In 2023, in Manhattan's most elite social setting, a billionaire had just used a racial epithet against a successful black CEO. The masks had finally slipped completely off, revealing the ugly truth beneath polite society's veneer. Marcus stood, absolutely still for a moment that felt like an eternity, feeling the weight of history, the pain of his ancestors, and the humiliation of his success being reduced to nothing by a single word. He thought about his father's steel-stained hands, his mother's sacrificed lunches, and every barrier he had overcome to reach this moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but clear enough for everyone to hear. Thank you, Harold. You've just saved me from making the biggest mistake of my career. Marcus turned and walked out of the Metropolitan Museum, leaving behind 500 shocked guests and a $900 million partnership that died with that single word. By the time he reached his car, videos of the confrontation were already being uploaded to social media by guests who had recorded the entire exchange. The next morning, the business world would wake up to a viral video of a black CEO being publicly humiliated by a billionaire white family. And the story of what that humiliation cost would change how America talked about racism, success, and the true price of dignity. The video went viral before Marcus even reached his Manhattan apartment. Shot from multiple angles by guests who had witnessed the confrontation, the footage captured every moment of his public humiliation and his dignified exit. By midnight, #WhitmoreRacism was trending worldwide, with millions of views and thousands of comments ranging from support to outrage to predictable denial and deflection. Marcus sat in his living room, still wearing his tuxedo, scrolling through the social media explosion, while his phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, investors, and business partners. The weight of what had just happened and what he had just walked away from settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The $900 million Whitmore partnership wasn't just a business deal. It was the key to Thomson Renewable Solutions' global expansion. The contract would have installed Marcus's revolutionary solar technology in 50 countries, created 10,000 jobs, and positioned his company as a leader in the international clean energy market. It represented the culmination of 8 years of building, sacrifice, and vision. Now it was gone, sacrificed on the altar of dignity and self-respect. His CFO, Sarah Chun, arrived at his apartment within an hour, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, and her expression grim. Sarah had been with the company since its early days. One of the first executives Marcus had hired when Thomson Renewable Solutions was still operating out of a shared workspace in Brooklyn. "The markets are going to crucify us tomorrow," she said without preamble, pulling up financial projections on her laptop. We were counting on the Whitmore deal for our Q4 numbers, our expansion plans, and our next funding round. Without it, we're looking at layoffs, delayed projects, and possibly having to take on debt to meet our current obligations. Marcus loosened his bow tie and sat across from Sarah, the reality of his decision crystallizing into harsh financial projections. "How bad is it?" "Potentially catastrophic," Sarah replied honestly. "We have 400 employees depending on this deal. We've already hired engineers and project managers in anticipation of the Whitmore expansion. We've signed leases on facilities in 3 cities. If we can't replace this revenue quickly, we'll have to cut our workforce by at least 30%. The human cost of his principled stand was staggering. Marcus thought about the engineers he had hired from HBCUs, the project managers who had left Secure, jobs to join his vision, the administrative staff who had believed in the company's mission. How could he explain to them that their jobs were now at risk because he had refused to tolerate racial humiliation? "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice growing more somber. "I've been getting calls from other partners and investors. Some are expressing concerns about the incident and what it means for future business relationships. Others are asking if we want to pursue alternative approaches to resolve the situation." Marcus understood the coded language. His other business partners were worried about being associated with someone who had publicly confronted white supremacy. They were suggesting he apologize, make amends, or find some way to repair the relationship with the Whitmores. The suggestion was as insulting as the original humiliation. The personal attacks came swiftly and predictably. Conservative media outlets framed Marcus as an angry black man who had attacked a prominent white family. Social media trolls dissected his background, questioned his achievements, and suggested he had played the race card to deflect from legitimate business criticism. The familiar playbook of victim blaming and racial gaslighting was deployed with surgical precision. But the support was overwhelming too. Civil rights leaders praised his dignity under pressure. Fellow black entrepreneurs shared their own stories of corporate humiliation. Environmental advocates rallied around his company's mission. The hashtag I Stand With Marcus began trending alongside the original video, creating a dual narrative of racism and resistance. Dr. Angela Davis, the legendary civil rights activist, called Marcus personally. "Young man," she said in her unmistakable voice, "you did something tonight that took courage most people will never understand. You chose your humanity over their money. That's revolution." But revolution didn't pay employee salaries or meet contractual obligations. By the end of the week, Thomson Renewable Solutions was facing its worst crisis since Marcus had founded the company. 3 major investors had pulled out of a planned funding round, citing reputational concerns and market volatility. Two corporate partners had quietly terminated preliminary negotiations for future projects. The company's stock price, though privately held, was being devalued by analysts who questioned its leadership stability. Marcus found himself in the impossible position of being punished for being the victim of racism. The Whitmore family had issued a carefully crafted public statement expressing regret for the misunderstanding, while subtly suggesting that Marcus had overreacted to innocent comments. Their army of PR professionals and legal advisors had worked overtime to reframe the narrative, portraying them as victims of an aggressive and unreasonable business partner. The psychological toll was severe. Marcus had spent his entire career building armor against racism, developing the emotional resilience to navigate predominantly white spaces with grace and professionalism. But the public nature of his humiliation, combined with the financial consequences of his response, created a perfect storm of trauma that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed defenses. Sleep became elusive. Marcus found himself replaying the confrontation over and over, wondering if he could have handled it differently, if he could have found a way to preserve both his dignity and his business. He thought about his employees, their families, their mortgages and children's college funds that were now at risk because of his decision. His parents, now in their 70s, flew in from Cleveland to offer support. Dorothy Thompson sat with her son in his apartment, holding his hands as she had when he was a child facing bullies at school. "Baby," she said quietly, "your daddy and I didn't sacrifice everything so you could bow down to people who don't respect you. We raised you to be a man, not a mascot. Some things are more important than money." James Thompson, his steel mill days long behind him, but his hands still bearing the scars of manual labor, looked at his son with fierce pride. "You did right, son. Every black man who comes after you will walk a little taller because you refuse to let them make you small." But the practical challenges remained overwhelming. Marcus convened emergency meetings with his executive team, exploring options for survival without the Whitmore deal. They considered taking on debt, selling equity at unfavorable terms, or dramatically scaling back operations. Each option would fundamentally change the company he had built and potentially compromise the mission that had driven him for 8 years. The media attention was relentless and exhausting. Marcus found himself thrust into a national conversation about racism in corporate America, a role he had never sought but could no longer avoid. Every interview request, every speaking opportunity, every platform offered was both an opportunity to advocate for change and a reminder of the humiliation that had made him a symbol. 3 weeks after the Metropolitan Museum confrontation, Marcus faced his darkest moment. Sitting in his office at 2 a.m., surrounded by financial projections and termination letters he might have to send to dozens of employees, he questioned everything. Had his principles cost too much? Had his refusal to accept humiliation destroyed the dreams of everyone who had believed in his vision? His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson, my name is David Park, CEO of Pacific Solar Industries. I saw what happened at the museum. I'd like to discuss a partnership opportunity that might interest you. Would you be willing to meet?" Marcus stared at the message for a long time, wondering if it was real or another cruel joke in a month that had been full of them. But something in the straightforward, respectful tone gave him hope. Maybe, just maybe, there were still people in corporate America who valued integrity over capitulation, who understood that standing up to racism was a business asset rather than a liability. He typed back, "I'd be honored to meet with you." That simple exchange would prove to be the turning point in a story that was far from over. Sometimes the most important battles are won not through confrontation, but through the quiet courage to keep believing in a better future, even when the present seems hopeless. The meeting with David Park took place 3 days later in a small conference room overlooking Central Park, far from the glittering ballrooms and exclusive clubs where Marcus had faced his humiliation. Park, the 45-year-old Korean-American CEO of Pacific Solar Industries, had built his company into a $3 billion renewable energy powerhouse over the past decade, focusing on innovative technology and international partnerships. "I want to be direct with you, Marcus," Park began, sliding a bound proposal across the table. What happened at the Whitmore Gala was disgusting, but it also revealed something important about the character of everyone involved. The Whitmores showed their true colors, and you showed yours. "I know which kind of person I want as a business partner." Marcus opened the proposal with trembling hands, hardly daring to hope. What he read took his breath away. Pacific Solar Industries was offering a $1.2 billion partnership, $300 million more than the abandoned Whitmore deal to integrate Thomson Renewable Solutions technology into their global operations across 75 countries. "This isn't charity," Park continued, anticipating Marcus's reaction. "This is business. Your solar panel innovations are exactly what we need for our expansion into emerging markets. The Whitmore's loss is my gain, and their racism just handed me the best partnership opportunity in the clean energy sector." But David Park wasn't just offering money. He was offering something more valuable: validation that Marcus's principles had been worth defending, that dignity and business success weren't mutually exclusive, and that there were still leaders in corporate America who understood that diversity wasn't just a moral imperative, but a competitive advantage. The announcement of the Pacific Solar Partnership sent shockwaves through the business world. Within 24 hours, Thomson Renewable Solutions' valuation had increased by 40%. Environmental groups hailed the deal as a victory for both clean energy and social justice. Most significantly, other companies began reaching out with partnership opportunities, investment proposals, and collaborative ventures. The Whitmore family's response was swift and predictable. Through their public relations team, they issued statements questioning the legitimacy of Marcus's new partnership, suggesting it was politically motivated rather than business-driven. Conservative media outlets echoed these talking points, arguing that Marcus was benefiting from reverse racism and sympathy rather than merit. But their narrative collapsed when Pacific Solar Industries released detailed financial projections, technology assessments, and market analyses demonstrating that the partnership was based on Thomson Renewable Solutions' superior innovation and market potential. David Park went on national television to personally defend the deal and Marcus's character. The Whitmores called Marcus Thomson an affirmative action beneficiary. Park said during his CNN interview, "I call him the most innovative CEO in renewable energy. They saw his race as a liability. I see his vision as an asset." That's the difference between companies that cling to the past and companies that build the future. The vindication was complete, but Marcus wasn't finished. The confrontation at the Metropolitan Museum had awakened something in him, a recognition that his success carried responsibilities beyond profit margins and market share. He began using his platform to advocate for broader changes in corporate America, speaking out about systemic racism, unconscious bias, and the barriers that still prevented talented people of color from achieving their potential. The movement that emerged around Marcus's story attracted unexpected allies. White executives who had witnessed similar incidents began speaking out about racism in their industries. Investors started scrutinizing the diversity practices of companies in their portfolios. Business schools began incorporating Marcus's experience into case studies about leadership, ethics, and the business case for inclusion. 6 months after the Metropolitan Museum incident, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the National Urban League's annual conference, addressing an audience of Black entrepreneurs, students, and community leaders. The Thomson Renewable Solutions logo behind him had been joined by those of 15 partner companies and organizations that had aligned themselves with his vision of inclusive capitalism. They tried to humiliate me into submission, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience and collective hope. They tried to reduce my achievements to racial preferences and my success to charity. But what they actually did was reveal the truth about how power operates in America, and they gave us the opportunity to build something better. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes, but Marcus wasn't finished. The $900 million they thought they were taking away from me, it became $1.2 billion with partners who valued excellence over exclusion. The reputation they thought they were destroying, it became a platform to advocate for change. The humiliation they intended to inflict, it became the foundation for a movement that's transforming how America does business. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Marcus introduced special guests, 50 young Black entrepreneurs who had received funding, mentorship, and partnership opportunities through the Thompson Foundation, which he had established with his proceeds from the Pacific Solar deal. Each represented a dream that might have been deferred, a vision that might have been denied, and a future that was now possible because one man had chosen dignity over dollars. The climax of Marcus's story wasn't just personal vindication, it was systemic transformation. The incident at the Metropolitan Museum had exposed the persistence of elite racism, but the response had demonstrated the power of principled resistance. Companies across America were being forced to confront their own cultures, practices, and leadership structures. The conversation about diversity and inclusion had evolved from voluntary initiatives to business imperatives. The Whitmore family's empire, meanwhile, faced unprecedented scrutiny. Investigations revealed patterns of discrimination in hiring, promotion, and contracting that stretched back decades. Several of their government contracts were terminated, following civil rights investigations. Their foundation lost major donors and board members who distanced themselves from the family's toxic brand. Most significantly, their stock price declined by 25% as institutional investors divested from companies associated with discriminatory practices. Harold Whitmore, who had called Marcus boy in front of 500 witnesses, found himself marginalized. In the same social circles where he had once been a power broker, the word that was meant to diminish Marcus had ultimately destroyed Harold's own reputation and influence. Standing in that Urban League auditorium, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from East Cleveland to this moment of triumph. The humiliation at the Metropolitan Museum had been the catalyst, but the real victory was what had emerged from that darkness. Proof that integrity was not just morally right, but strategically smart. That standing up to racism was not just personally necessary, but economically powerful, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply refusing to accept the unacceptable. The boy who had been told to no. His place had created a new place, not just for himself, but for everyone who would come after him. 2 years after the Metropolitan Museum incident, a transformation was undeniable and far-reaching. Thompson Renewable Solutions had grown into a $5 billion company with operations in 80 countries, employing over 5,000 people and leading the global transition to clean energy. The partnership with Pacific Solar Industries had exceeded all projections, creating innovations that were revolutionizing how the world produced and consumed energy. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real impact of Marcus Thompson's stand could be seen in the ripple effects that continued to spread throughout corporate America and beyond. The Thompson Foundation had become one of the most influential organizations supporting minority entrepreneurs, providing not just funding but mentorship, networking, and advocacy. Over 500 Black and Latino businesses had received support, creating thousands of jobs and generating billions in economic activity. The Foundation's annual conference had become a premier gathering for diverse business leaders, attracting Fortune 500 CEOs, venture capitalists, and policymakers committed to inclusive capitalism. Marcus stood in the Foundation's new headquarters in downtown Atlanta, a gleaming 40-story tower that had been designed by a black architectural firm and built by minority-owned construction companies. The building's solar panels were manufactured using Thomson Renewable Solutions technology, creating a visible symbol of how economic empowerment and environmental sustainability could work together. "Dad, are you ready?" his daughter Zoe asked, adjusting her cap and gown. At 16, she was graduating as valedictorian from the same elite prep school that had once questioned whether Marcus belonged. But unlike her father's experience, she was surrounded by a diverse cohort of students, whose presence was now seen as an asset rather than an anomaly. Marcus's personal life had flourished alongside his professional success. He had married Dr. Aisha Williams, a brilliant surgeon and fellow activist, 2 years earlier. Their blended family included Zoe from Marcus's previous relationship and Aisha's twin sons, all of whom were growing up in a world where their possibilities seemed limitless. The ceremony at Zoe's school was attended by many of the same elite families who had witnessed Marcus's humiliation at the Metropolitan Museum 2 years earlier. But the dynamic had completely shifted. Where once he had been an outsider seeking acceptance, he now commanded respect as one of the most successful and influential business leaders of his generation. During the graduation reception, several parents approached Marcus with a mixture of admiration and awkwardness. These were people who had watched him be called "boy" by Harold Whitmore and had said nothing in the moment. Now they wanted to associate themselves with his success, to claim some connection to the man who had become a symbol of principled leadership. "Marcus, I've been following your company's progress," said Catherine Morrison, whose husband sat on several corporate boards. "What you've built is truly remarkable. I wonder if you might consider speaking at our diversity summit next month." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The same people who had stood silent during his humiliation now wanted him to educate them about inclusion. But he had learned that change often came through uncomfortable conversations with uncomfortable people, and he accepted the invitation with grace. The broader impact of Marcus's story extended far beyond individual business success. A study by Harvard Business School found that companies with diverse leadership teams were 35% more likely to outperform their competitors, citing the Thomson effect, the idea that principled stands against discrimination could actually enhance rather than damage business performance. Corporate America had been forced to confront its practices in ways that went beyond superficial diversity initiatives. The viral video of Marcus's humiliation had become a teaching tool in business schools, corporate training programs, and leadership development courses. Companies were implementing dignity audits to assess how they treated employees and partners. From underrepresented groups, the legal ramifications were significant as well. The U.S. Department of Justice had launched investigations into several major corporations based on evidence of systemic discrimination revealed in the wake of Marcus's story. Employment discrimination lawsuits increased by 40% as victims felt empowered to speak out about their experiences. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission cited the Thomson precedent in several high-profile cases. The Whitmore family's downfall had been as spectacular as Marcus's rise. Harold Whitmore had been forced to resign from multiple corporate boards and charitable organizations. The family's business empire was under federal investigation for discriminatory practices, and their net worth had declined by nearly 30% due to boycotts, divestment, and legal settlements. Most significantly, Harrison Whitmore, the heir apparent, who had questioned Marcus's legitimacy, had reached out through intermediaries to request a private meeting. When they finally sat down in Marcus's office, the contrast was stark. Marcus commanding and confident behind his desk, Harrison humbled and seeking redemption. "I owe you an apology," Harrison began, his voice lacking the arrogance that had characterized their first encounter. What my family did was inexcusable. What I said was inexcusable. I've spent the last 2 years learning about the privileges I took for granted and the harm we caused. Marcus studied the younger man, noting the genuine contrition in his voice. An apology is a start, Harrison, but actions matter more than words. What are you doing to make things right? Harrison outlined the changes he was implementing at Whitmore Industries. Mandatory bias training for all executives, partnerships with minority-owned suppliers, and a $100 million fund to support Black-owned businesses. It was progress, though Marcus wondered if it would have happened without the financial consequences that had forced the family to reckon with their behavior. The conversation lasted 2 hours, covering everything from systemic racism to personal responsibility to the possibility of future collaboration. Marcus didn't forgive easily. The wounds were too deep and the harm too extensive, but he respected Harrison's efforts to acknowledge and address the damage his family had caused. The transformation in Marcus's own community was perhaps the most meaningful aspect of his journey. East Cleveland, where he had grown up in poverty, was now home to 3 Thompson Foundation-funded businesses and a state-of-the-art STEM education center that bore his name. Young people who might once have seen limited possibilities now had tangible examples of what was achievable. Marcus's parents, now in their late 70s, had moved to a comfortable retirement community funded by their son's success. But they continued to volunteer at the education center, sharing their stories with children who reminded them of their grandson at that age. Dorothy Thompson, the woman who had cleaned office buildings to pay for Marcus's books, now sat on the board of directors of one of the most influential foundations in America. "Baby," she told Marcus during one of their weekly phone calls, "you did more than build a company. You opened doors that were locked for generations. Every Black child who grows up believing they can be anything they want, that's your real legacy." The ripple effects continued to expand internationally as well. Thompson Renewable Solutions. Global operations were transforming energy access in developing countries, bringing electricity to communities that had never had reliable power. The company's commitment to hiring locally and partnering with indigenous businesses was creating economic opportunities that extended far beyond clean energy. Marcus had been invited to speak at the World Economic Forum, the United Nations Climate Summit, and dozens of other international venues where he advocated for inclusive approaches to global challenges. His message was consistent. Diversity wasn't just morally right, it was practically necessary for solving complex problems that affected diverse populations. The personal cost of his journey remained significant. Marcus still carried the emotional scars of that night at the Metropolitan Museum, still felt the weight of being a symbol rather than simply a successful businessman, still faced the burden of representing his entire race in predominantly white spaces. But he had found ways to transform that pain into purpose, to use his platform to create opportunities for others who faced similar challenges. Standing in his foundation's boardroom, looking out over the Atlanta skyline, Marcus reflected on the distance he had traveled from that moment when Harold Whitmore had called him boy. The word that was meant to diminish him had ultimately become the catalyst for his greatest achievements. The humiliation that was designed to put him in his place had instead inspired him to create new places where dignity was non-negotiable. His phone buzzed with a text from David Park. "Congratulations on the UN appointment. Looking forward to our next partnership changing the world." Marcus smiled, remembering the dark night when he had thought his career might be over, when the financial projections seemed insurmountable, when the choice between principles and profit had seemed like choosing between integrity and survival. He had learned that sometimes the most important decisions weren't about what you could gain, but about what you refused to lose. The boy from East Cleveland, who had been told to know his place, had instead decided to build new places. where excellence was recognized regardless of race, where dignity was protected regardless of power dynamics, and where the next generation would inherit a world more just than the one they had received. Marcus Thompson's story began with 20 seconds of humiliation that cost him $900 million. But it ended with a transformation that enriched millions of lives and reshaped how America thinks about success, dignity, and the true cost of racism. His journey from that ballroom in the Metropolitan Museum to global leadership teaches us profound lessons about courage, integrity, and the power of principled resistance. The incident at the Whitmore Gala was not unique. It reflected patterns of discrimination that successful black professionals face every day in corporate America. What made Marcus's experience different was not the racism itself, but his response to it. He could have swallowed his pride, accepted the humiliation, and preserved the business deal. Instead, he chose to walk away from generational wealth rather than compromise his dignity. That choice revealed something essential about the nature of racism in elite spaces. The Whitmore's behavior was not aberrational. It was systemic. Their assumption that they could publicly humiliate a black CEO without consequences reflected decades of operating in environments where such behavior was tolerated, normalized, and protected by wealth and power. Marcus's refusal to accept that treatment exposed the ugly reality beneath polite society's veneer. His story demonstrates that individual acts of racism are symptoms of institutional problems that require institutional solutions. The transformation that followed his stand wasn't just about one man's vindication. It was about forcing entire industries to confront their cultures, practices, and assumptions about who belongs in positions of power and influence. The business case for dignity proved itself spectacularly. Marcus's principled stand didn't destroy his career. It elevated it to heights he could never have imagined while tolerating discrimination. The partnership with Pacific Solar Industries that replaced the Whitmore deal was worth $300 million more and came with a corporate culture that valued integrity alongside innovation. The companies that distanced themselves from him after the incident were replaced by partners who saw his character as an asset rather than a liability. But perhaps the most important lesson from Marcus's journey is that success without justice is incomplete. He could have achieved financial prosperity while accepting the humiliation that came with it, could have built wealth while tolerating the racism that surrounded it. Instead, he understood that his success was meaningful only if it created pathways for others, only if it challenged the systems that had tried to limit him, and only if it left the world more just than he had found it. The ripple effects of his decision continued to expand years later. The hundreds of businesses supported by the Thompson Foundation, the thousands of jobs created by his partnerships, the millions of people with access to clean energy because of his innovations, all of these exist because one man refused to be diminished by racism and chose to build something better instead. Marcus's story also reveals the collective power of supporting those who stand up to injustice. David Park's decision to partner with him, the investors who backed him despite controversy, the employees who stood by him through uncertainty, they all played crucial roles in transforming individual resistance into systemic change. Progress happens not just through the courage of those who face discrimination, but through the solidarity of those who choose to stand with them. The transformation of the Whitmore family, while incomplete, suggests that even the most entrenched racism can be challenged when it carries real consequences. Harold Whitmore's fall from grace, Harrison's efforts at redemption, and the family business's financial struggles all demonstrate that discrimination is not just morally wrong, but practically costly in an increasingly diverse and conscious marketplace. Today, as we continue to grapple with racism in all its forms, Marcus Thompson's story provides both inspiration and instruction. It shows us that change is possible when people of conscience refuse to accept the unacceptable, when allies step forward to support those facing discrimination, and when society holds institutions accountable for their behavior. The story also reminds us that the fight for equality is not just about individual success, but about collective liberation. Marcus's achievements were meaningful, not because he made it despite racism, but because he used his success to tear down the barriers that prevent others from making it as well. His legacy is not just the company he built or the wealth he created, but the doors he opened and the possibilities he made real for generations that will follow. The call to action from Marcus's story is clear. We cannot be passive in the face of discrimination. We cannot be satisfied with individual success while systemic barriers remain, and we cannot wait for others to create the change we want to see. Whether we're entrepreneurs building inclusive businesses, consumers choosing where to spend our money, or citizens demanding accountability from institutions, we all have a role to play in creating a more just society. The 20 seconds that Harold Whitmore thought would put Marcus Thompson in his place instead sparked a movement that continues to reshape American business. The word boy that was meant to diminish became the catalyst for unprecedented elevation. The humiliation that was designed to enforce hierarchy instead became the foundation for a more equitable future. Marcus Thompson's story reminds us that our response to injustice defines not just our character, but our destiny. We can choose to accept discrimination as the price of participation in society, or we can choose to challenge it as a barrier to a better world. We can choose individual success within flawed systems, or we can choose to build better systems that create success for all. The choice is ours. But the lesson of Marcus's life is clear. When we choose courage over comfort, principle over profit, and justice over individual gain, we don't just change our own lives, we change the world. His story continues to unfold, inspiring new generations of leaders who understand that true success is measured not by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we make possible for others. The man who is called boy in a room full of America's most powerful people became a force that transformed how that power operates. His dignity, preserved at great cost, became the foundation for unprecedented change, and his refusal to be diminished by racism became the catalyst for a more just and inclusive future that continues to emerge, one principled decision at a time.